There is a particular silence that exists in old Japanese merchant homes that were built during the Edo period. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of intention. Every object in its place, every document folded with care, every transaction recorded in a ledger that was not meant for banks or governments, but for the family itself, for the generations that had not yet been born. I have sat inside a few of those homes, the ones that still stand in Osaka and in the older districts of Kyoto, where the wooden facades have darkened with centuries of weather, but the interior structures remain almost unchanged. And what I noticed each time was not the architecture, it was the absence of anxiety. These were families that had held wealth across 4 centuries, through devastating fires, through wars, through the complete dismantling and reconstruction of Japanese society, not once, but several times. Their wealth did not survive because of luck, or because of favorable markets, or because they happened to be in the right place at the right time. It survived because of a code, a set of principles so quietly integrated into daily life that the families themselves sometimes forgot they were following it. It had simply become who they were. It had become the air inside those silent rooms. In the West, wealth is almost always spoken about in terms of acquisition, how much you earn, how much you accumulate, what you own, what your portfolio returned last quarter. The conversation begins with getting, and it rarely travels much further than that. The assumption embedded in nearly every book, every seminar, every piece of financial advice produced in the last century of American culture is that the problem to be solved is how to get more. In Japan, particularly among the merchant families of the Edo period, the conversation began somewhere entirely different. It began with a question that most American financial advisors have never thought to ask their clients and would not know how to answer if they did. What is this money for, beyond your own lifetime? That question changes everything, not just the strategy, the identity, the way a man relates to what he holds, what he spends, what he protects, and what he passes forward. The answer to that question, and more importantly, the structures that the great merchant families of Edo, Japan, built to honor that answer across generations, is what I want to share with you today. If you have ever felt, quietly and without being able to fully articulate it, that something essential is missing from the financial wisdom that your culture offered you, that there is a layer of understanding that the books and the advisors and the television programs never quite reached, you were not wrong. You were simply looking in the right direction without a map. What I want to offer you today is part of that map, not all of it. This tradition is deep enough that no single conversation can contain it, but enough to change how you see what you already have. To understand the merchant code of Edo, Japan, you must first understand the world in which it was born. Because the code did not emerge from comfort or from theory, it was forged under pressure in conditions that would have destroyed any financial philosophy built on shallow foundations. Japan sealed itself from the outside world in 1635 under the Tokugawa shogunate's policy of national isolation known as sakoku, which translates with remarkable honesty as chained country. For more than 2 centuries, from roughly 1603 to 1868, Japan existed in a condition of enforced stillness, no meaningful foreign trade except through a single, tightly controlled port at Nagasaki, no access to European banking systems, no exposure to the speculative financial instruments that were simultaneously and dramatically reshaping wealth in Amsterdam, in London, and later in the cities of the American Eastern Seaboard. From the outside, this looks like deprivation. From the inside, it was a crucible that produced something extraordinary. Without external markets to expand into, without colonial frontiers to exploit, without the possibility of simply growing outward, Japanese merchant families, particularly those concentrated in the great commercial city of Osaka, which served as the financial heart of Edo, Japan, were forced to turn their intelligence inward. They could not grow outward, so they grew deeper. They refined their internal systems of wealth management to a degree of sophistication that had no parallel anywhere else in the world at that time, and that the West has still not fully appreciated. The merchant class in Edo, Japan occupied a position that was, by any measure, paradoxical. Under the rigid Confucian social hierarchy of the Tokugawa period, a hierarchy enforced with the full weight of samurai authority, merchants ranked at the absolute bottom, below samurai, below farmers, below artisans. The official ideology of the period treated merchants as parasites, people who profited from the labor and production of others without creating anything themselves. They were taxed heavily, restricted in what they could wear, limited in where they could live. A wealthy merchant could not publicly display his wealth in ways that might embarrass the samurai class above him. And yet, over the course of the Edo period, the great merchant families of Osaka and Edo accumulated wealth that dwarfed that of many daimyo, the regional feudal lords who theoretically held power over them. Samurai who would not acknowledge a merchant's existence in a public street would appear quietly at the merchant's private door, asking for loans. The power hierarchy was official. The financial reality was something else entirely. The Sumitomo family is perhaps the most remarkable example of what this period produced. Founded in the early 17th century by Masatomo Sumitomo, who began as a book and medicine seller in Kyoto before the family pivoted into copper smelting and international trade through the Nagasaki port, the Sumitomos built a commercial institution that has now endured for nearly 400 years. They are today one of the largest financial conglomerates in the world. The Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation, Sumitomo Corporation, Sumitomo Chemical. These are not new companies wearing an old name. They are the living continuation of a financial philosophy that was articulated in the 17th century and has never been fully abandoned. The Mitsui family followed a trajectory equally remarkable. Takatoshi Mitsui, born in 1622 in Matsusaka, in what is now Mie Prefecture, transformed a modest sake and dry goods business into an institution that would eventually become one of the largest trading companies in the history of Japanese commerce. He opened what historians consider one of the first true department stores in Japanese history, the Echigoya clothing store in Edo, which later became the Mitsukoshi department store chain that still operates today. But the innovation that made him legendary was not the store itself. It was the philosophy behind it. Most merchants of his era sold on credit at negotiated prices through relationships of personal obligation that were deliberately kept murky. Takatoshi did the opposite. He sold for cash at fixed and publicly stated prices with no negotiation and no hidden terms. In a commercial environment built on opacity and personal relationship debt, he chose radical transparency. His customers could trust that the price they saw was the real price. That trust compounded over decades into something more valuable than any single transaction, institutional reputation that outlasted any individual. The Konoike family of Osaka built their fortune initially in sake brewing before recognizing that the real opportunity lay in what today we would call financial services. They became currency exchangers, lenders, and eventually the primary financial intermediaries between the feudal domains and the central Tokugawa government. By the mid-Edo period, they held enough accumulated capital to finance the ongoing operations of regional governments. Feudal lords who commanded armies were functionally dependent on the financial judgment of a family that officially ranked below them in every social category. The Konoike understood this with perfect clarity, and they never made the mistake of making the lords feel it publicly. What unified the Sumitomo, the Mitsui, and the Konoike, and dozens of other great Osaka merchant houses whose names are less familiar to Western audiences was not a shared product or a shared market or a shared geography. What they shared was a document. In some families, a literal written document. In others, a body of oral instruction passed from senior members to carefully chosen successors through years of apprenticeship and example. These documents governed not just business decisions, but the relationship of every family member to money itself, how it was to be categorized, how decisions about it were to be made, What risks were permanently forbidden regardless of how attractive they appeared, and what proportion of accumulated wealth was to be treated as belonging not to the living, but to those who had not yet been born. The Sumitomo family called their foundational business principles the Monjuin Shigaki, a set of operational and philosophical guidelines first articulated in the 1600s by Ryemon Soga, a copper processing innovator who married into the Sumitomo family and became the architect of their commercial philosophy. One of the most cited principles from this document translates approximately as, "Do not pursue easy profits, do not expand too rapidly, do not neglect the foundation of what has already been built." 3 prohibitions, not 3 aspirations. The wisdom was framed as restraint, not ambition. The Mitsui family maintained a remarkably detailed house constitution known as the Mitsui Chohoki, compiled in the early 18th century, which specified in extraordinary detail how profits were to be divided among family branches, how young family members were to be trained in commercial discipline before being given any financial responsibility, what categories of risk were permanently forbidden, and perhaps most significantly, how disputes between family members regarding money were to be resolved. Not through individual authority, but through a formal family council that required consensus before any major financial decision could be implemented. What strikes me about these documents, having spent decades studying them and the families that produced them, is not their complexity. It is their restraint. They are not strategies for expansion. They are not formulas for accumulation. They are, at their philosophical core, constitutions of containment. And the discipline of knowing what you will not do with money, the clarity of permanent prohibition, is the foundation upon which everything else in this tradition rests. The central principle of the Edo Merchant Code does not translate cleanly into English. This is not an accident of language. It is evidence that the concept itself does not exist in the Western financial tradition, that there is no English word for it, because the English-speaking world never fully developed the practice it describes. The term I will use as our anchor today is Shisan Bunri. In its most literal translation, this means the separation of assets. But that translation is a photograph of a landscape that needs to be walked through slowly to be understood. Let me explain what it actually meant in practice and why it worked with the consistency that it did across centuries. Shisan Bunri was not simply diversification in the modern financial sense, the spreading of investments across different asset classes to reduce risk. That understanding, while not wrong, is far too thin. At its philosophical core, Shisan Bunri was built on a recognition that money holds different qualities depending on its designated purpose, and that the mixing of those qualities, allowing money designated for one purpose to flow freely toward another purpose, is the primary mechanism by which family wealth is destroyed across generations. Not market crashes, not bad luck, not external catastrophe, the mixing of purposes, the absence of clear walls between different categories of wealth. The Edo merchants divided their accumulated wealth into 3 fundamental categories, and these divisions were treated with the same seriousness and enforced with the same discipline that a samurai applied to understanding which sword he carried for which purpose. Each served a different function. Each was governed by its own rules. And crossing those boundaries, using wealth designated for one category to serve the purposes of another, was considered not merely a financial error, but a violation of the family's fundamental integrity. The first category was what we might translate as living money. The Japanese concept closest to this is seikatsuhi, the funds allocated specifically for the sustenance of daily life. This money was not to be grown. It was not to be invested. It was not to be displayed or expanded. It was to be sufficient. The entire discipline within this category resided in the definition of sufficiency, not abundance, not hardship, but a carefully and deliberately considered figure that allowed the family to live with dignity, with comfort, and without consuming more than was genuinely necessary. What is remarkable, and what makes this category so difficult for Western readers to fully appreciate, is that this figure, once established by the family council, was largely fixed regardless of what happened to the family's overall wealth. As the Mitsui fortune grew through the 18th century to levels that made them among the wealthiest institutions in Asia, the seikatsuhi allocation for individual family members changed very slowly and by formal decision rather than by drift. The growing wealth did not automatically convert into growing personal expenditure. The link between more wealth and more spending, an assumption so deeply embedded in Western economic culture that most people do not even recognize it as an assumption, was deliberately and formally severed. That act of severance is where the psychological genius of the system begins. In Western financial culture, lifestyle expansion follows wealth expansion almost automatically, as if by gravity. When income rises, spending rises to match it. When a windfall arrives, the definition of normal living adjusts upward. The Edo merchants understood this tendency with complete clarity, and they built the family financial constitution specifically to counteract it, not by demanding that family members live poorly, but by requiring that any change in the seikatsuhi allocation be a formal, deliberate, council-approved decision rather than an unconscious drift. The second category was seed money, what the tradition refers to as tanazini, literally seed coin. This was the portion of accumulated wealth designated for investment, for business operations, for the commercial activities that would generate future return and allow the family enterprise to continue growing. It was protected by elaborate and specific rules about what categories of risk were permissible within this category. And the rules were not vague philosophical guidelines, but concrete, enforceable prohibitions written into the family constitution. The Mitsui House Constitution, for example, explicitly prohibited speculation in commodities that the family did not directly handle within their own established lines of trade. It was not sufficient to observe an opportunity in a market and calculate that profit was likely. The opportunity had to exist within the family's domain of genuine, experiential, generational understanding. This is a principle that eliminates, by design, the majority of get-rich-quick opportunities that present themselves in every era, and the elimination is the point. This is where the concept of Kaizen becomes relevant in a financial context that most Western commentators have never considered. We know Kaizen from its application in manufacturing, the Toyota production system, the philosophy of continuous incremental improvement applied to processes and quality over time. But for the Edo merchants, Kaizen was equally and perhaps primarily a financial philosophy. The expectation built into the tanazini category was never dramatic return. It was never the transformation of capital through a single brilliant trade. The expectation was consistent, reliable, incremental growth, compounded patiently across decades with the same deliberate attention that a master craftsman applies to perfecting a single technique across a lifetime of practice. While Dutch merchants in Amsterdam were constructing joint stock companies and trading futures contracts on tulip bulbs, financial instruments designed specifically for the rapid multiplication of capital through speculation, the great Osaka merchant houses were refining their established trade routes by small and measurable percentages, year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation. The contrast is not incidental. It reflects two entirely different philosophies about what money is, what it is for, and what relationship a human being should have with it. The third category of Shisan Bunri is the one that has no genuine equivalent anywhere in the mainstream Western financial tradition. The concept the Edo merchants used in various formulations across different family traditions is nochi no kane. Later money, or more precisely and more beautifully, money for what comes after. This was wealth that was formally, deliberately, and irrevocably removed from the reach of the current generation. It could not be spent on living expenses, regardless of pressure. It could not be pledged as collateral against business loans, regardless of opportunity. It could barely be discussed as belonging to any person currently alive. It belonged, in the deepest philosophical sense of the word, to the family name, which is to say, to the generations that had not yet arrived. The psychological architecture of this is worth examining slowly because it is the part of this system that the Western mind tends to resist most strongly, and also the part that contains the most profound wisdom. By formally separating this wealth and declaring it permanently untouchable, the great merchant families removed it from the realm of temptation entirely. They understood something about human psychology that modern behavioral economics has only recently begun to document with scientific precision, that the willpower required to resist spending in a moment of pressure is finite, unreliable, and ultimately inadequate as a long-term financial strategy. Willpower fails. Character wavers under sufficient pressure. But a formal constitutional prohibition, a rule decided in calm, written down, agreed to by the family council, and treated as a binding commitment rather than a personal preference, operates differently. It moves the decision out of the realm of individual willpower and into the realm of institutional structure. When financial pressure arrived, and it always arrived in the form of a catastrophic fire consuming the warehouse district, or a feudal lord demanding an extraordinary loan, or a bad trading season that compressed margins for years, there was no question within the family about whether the nochi no cane would be touched. The answer had already been given, years or decades earlier, in a moment of calm deliberation. The most important financial decision of all, what is permanently protected, had been made once clearly, and then placed beyond the reach of any single individual's panic or ambition. There is an old Japanese proverb that the merchant families use to articulate this principle to younger members. Ato de kokai suru mae ni kangai. Think before you regret later. But the deeper wisdom embedded in the three-category system goes further than that proverb suggests. It is not merely an instruction to think carefully before acting. It is a structural design that ensures the most consequential thinking happens before the pressure arrives, that the walls are built in sunshine, not in the storm. Why did this code not cross the ocean? Why did it not find its way into the financial traditions of Europe or into the vast body of personal finance wisdom that American culture has produced over the past century? This is a question worth sitting with in honest silence, because the answer is not simple, and it reveals something important, not about failure, but about the invisible assumptions that different civilizations build their economic lives upon. The first reason is structural, and it is the most straightforward. The Edo Merchant Code was never designed to be exported. It was not a published philosophy. It was not a teaching offered to the general public. It was transmitted within families, across generations, through years of direct apprenticeship and careful example. The Mitsui House Constitution was a private document, guarded, not shared. The Sumitomo principles were not taught in schools or written for general audiences. They existed and derived much of their power from existing precisely because access to them was limited to those within the lineage who had demonstrated both the character and the patience to receive them. Western financial knowledge developed in a culture that was built on precisely the opposite impulse. From Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations to Benjamin Franklin's famous aphorisms about thrift and industry, Western financial wisdom was conceived to be broadly disseminated, publicly argued, and universally applied. This produced extraordinary innovation. The open exchange of ideas about markets, capital, and investment generated the most dynamic economic system in human history. But it also meant that the subtlest and most demanding principles, the ones that required deep cultural context, multi-generational commitment, and a specific relationship with time to actually practice, were never transmitted intact across cultural boundaries. They lost something irreplaceable in the translation, or they were never translated at all. The second reason is philosophical, and it runs deeper. The Edo Merchant Code was built on a relationship with time that was specific to the conditions of Tokugawa Japan in ways that have no direct parallel in Western economic history. The Sakoku period gave Japan something profoundly unusual in the history of human civilization, more than 2 centuries of enforced structural stability. There were no foreign invasions. There were no colonial frontiers opening up with new resources to exploit. There were no revolutionary ruptures with the past. that made the future unrecognizable from the present. In that extraordinary stillness, thinking across generations became not merely a virtue, but a rational strategy. Planning specifically for your grandchildren's financial security was a reasonable activity because the world in which your grandchildren would live was highly likely to resemble, in its fundamental commercial and social structures, the world in which you live today. Western civilization, and American civilization in particular, developed in conditions that were almost precisely opposite. Constant change, constant expansion, one frontier after another, geographic, then industrial, then technological, then financial. In a world where the landscape transforms completely within a single lifetime, the idea of binding your family to financial principles written in a different era can feel not just impractical, but irrational. This is a genuinely honest objection, and I do not dismiss it. But I will offer this observation in return. The families that ask that question, the ones that decline to bind themselves to any long-term financial structure on the grounds that the future was too uncertain, are, in most cases, no longer wealthy beyond a single generation. And the families that found a way to maintain their core principles across